Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekly reading report. It's time for my weekly reading report, that thrill-packed program where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week. And I did read some stuff, so let's talk about that. Are you ready, Roger? Roger's raring to go. Look at him. Okay, let me break out my list for the 500 book challenge. The ever ongoing, never ending challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones. Okay, where did we leave off last week? We left off at book 303, The Angry Dead by Rosemary Pardo. That was a good book. That brought us to book 304. Okay, book 304 was this book, Legion from the Shadows. Legion from the Shadows, by Carl Edward Wagner, the great Carl Edward Wagner, who wrote fantasy. He wrote a lot of dark fantasy and horror in the 1970s and going into the 1980s. He died too young because, well, he drank too much. He drank too much, Roger. Way too much. Poor fella. And, yeah, we lost him at far too young an age. But while he was with us, he wrote some great stuff. He is best known nowadays for his Kane novels, which I think are still stupidly out of print, if I'm not incorrect. I think those are still out of print. But they're great, great books. And he wrote a lot of horror, and he was an editor for the world's best horror stories, or the best horror stories of the year, or something like that. He was great, Carl Edward Wagner. And he was a fan of Robert E. Howard. And he was hired by Zebra Books to write this book, which is a book about Bran MacMorn, Robert E. Howard's great character, Bran MacMorn, the King of the Picts. So Carl Edward Wagner did a couple of Robert E. Howard pastiche novels. He did a Conan pastiche novel, and this one, which is a bit more unusual, a Bran MacMorn pastiche novel. Robert E. Howard was very, very popular in the 1970s, and Zebra Books had a series of Robert E. Howard paperbacks that were doing quite well. But they wanted more. So they decided to do a sequel to Worms of the Earth, their paperback Worms of the Earth, which was a collection of Bran MacMorn stories. So they hired Carl Edward Wagner to do this, Legion from the Shadows. And it's interesting. This is a good book. It is not as good as Robert E. Howard's original stories. It is also not as good as Carl Edward Wagner's original stories. It's not, it couldn't touch his Kane stuff or even a lot of his horror, but it is a good book, and it's really interesting. So Carl Edward Wagner had to write basically a novel-length Bran MacMorn story, and there were no novel-length Bran MacMorn stories. So he had to write a novel-length Bran MacMorn story, and it's kind of a sequel. Well, it is a sequel, basically, to Worms of the Earth, one of Robert E. Howard's greatest stories, which is a tough thing to do. But if anyone could do it, I guess it would be Carl Edward Wagner. And he mostly succeeds, He does very well with the character of Bran MacMorn. He gets that character pretty much right. And the characters in this book are pretty great, with the exception of one character who is not terrible, but is kind of terrible. And so in this story, it starts off with the destruction of the 9th Legion of Rome, the mysterious destruction of the 9th Legion, which was a real legion that was probably wiped out by, well, they were wiped out by enemies, and we don't really know much about what happened to them. But they did disappear, and in this story, they are destroyed by Picts. Bran MacMorn's, I think it's his great-grandfather, wipes them out, and they drive some of the army into a cave. Some of the legion, I should say, takes refuge in a cave. And instead of going into that cave and, suffering a bunch of losses or whatever, the Picts decide, hey, let's just trap them in the cave. And so they roll a bunch of boulders in front of the cave, and they're like, ha ha, take that, guys. You're going to slowly starve to death in the dark. What a terrible fate. But their fate was even worse than that, because in Robert E. Howard's stories, remember, beneath the earth live the dreadful worms of the earth, these horrific creatures that were once sort of human and now are not really human at all. And they're just dreadful, awful creatures, which in The Worms of the Earth, the original story by Robert E. Howard, we didn't get really a good look at these creatures. They were very mysterious and awful. We get a much better look at them in this story, which is sort of unfortunate after a while. So anyway, what happens is that the Ninth Legion are not immediately killed. They suffer a fate worse than death. And they end up interbreeding with the worms of the earth, which doesn't sound fun at all. And their children end up being a new underground legion. Their descendants become a new legion underneath the earth, a combination of human and this creepy lizard-like creature that the worms of the earth are. And that becomes important later on in the story, what happens to this Ninth Legion. This new Ninth Legion from underneath the earth goes to war with the Picts. It's interesting. A lot of this story takes place beneath the earth and the world of the worms of the earth and this new creepy Ninth Legion. And Bran McMorn, his sister ends up being kidnapped because such things happen. And he goes, he travels underneath the earth to rescue her. And all kinds of horrific things happen. It's good. It's a good book. It has moments that are really creepy and horrific. Carl Edward Wagner was really good at the dark stuff. And he kind of fulfills his mission in a way in that this feels like a Weird Tales story. Just an extra long Weird Tales story. But it doesn't rate with Robert E. Howard's original work. First of all, like I said, you get far too good a look at the worms of the earth, so they lose a lot of their mystery. There's actually a lot of talking in this book. In the beginning, you get a lot of exposition, this inexplicable amount of exposition in history. And basically, you have two characters talking about history that they both already know, and they're only talking about it so that you, the reader, know all of this stuff. And it goes on for pages, I think. And there's some of that in this book. So the book starts off with like a big exposition dump. And there's some of that. The biggest flaw, I think, is that it ends up being, in its plot, a really basic Weird Tales pulp plot, but stretched out, So even though a lot of the writing is excellent to great, it can't overcome that. And there's a main villain, because the worms of the earth end up having like a kind of a king, a main villain who is a pure serpent man from the not from the Hyborian age, from the pre-cataclysmic age, a serpent man from the days of King Kull. So we remember the serpent people from the King Kull stories, the Shadow Kingdom in particular. And he is one of the last real serpent men. And the worms of the earth are kind of degenerate descendants of the serpent men, apparently. And he is basically Ming the Merciless underground. He is just your typical you're a very typical pulp villain. You know, if he had a mustache, he'd be twirling it. You know, Brad McMurn, I have you in my power now, and it's that kind of thing. And so the villain is just pretty basic, but the writing is excellent, and there are moments of just great horror. There are great horrific moments in this. There's some good tension in this. It does feel a little bit too long for what it is, and that could be just because I've read a million pulp stories that have similar plots that are much shorter. But Carl Edward Wagner, he pretty much fulfilled his mission. This is what I think he thought Zebra wanted, and so he delivered. He delivered on that. It's a good book. It's just not as good as everything else he did. And it did make me think, I've got to get back to reading the rest of the Kane books. I read all of the Kane short stories a while ago, and it's been a long time since I've read the novels, so I'm going to get back to those, revisit that stuff. But this was excellent. It was a good book. It just wasn't, as great as it could have been if Carl Edward Wagner had really cut loose and did something a little bit more original. But for what it was interesting. It was interesting. It was good. If you ever see it lying around, definitely pick it up. Legion from the Shadows by Carl Edward Wagner, based off of characters by the great Robert E. Howard. So I read that. All right, so that was book 304. That brings us to book 305, Doc Savage. It's Doc Savage once again. Doc Savage, The Phantom City. So I am reading every month a Doc Savage adventure, and I'm reading them in the order that the Doc Savage stories were originally published in the pulp magazine, which is not how they were reprinted later in the paperbacks. So I'm reading them in original pulp magazine order, which is good because they do reference a lot of earlier stories in all the stories that you read from Doc Savage. And this was the 10th adventure. This paperback is number 10, so they got it right this time. And it's excellent. Another excellent Doc Savage adventure. I don't know that it's the best Doc Savage adventure, but it's pretty good. More terrible villains in this one, and Doc Savage has to break out his submarine and go on basically a Lost World adventure where he finds a lost world of people and horrific ape monsters. They're kind of Bigfoot, right, Roger? Only there are like thousands of them. He finds a lost city, which is the Phantom City, and he also finds a bunch of Bigfoot monsters, and he has to deal with a sneering, awful villain, and that villain's dreadful henchmen. And Doc Savage and his 5 aides. You can see them all hanging out there behind Doc Savage's giant head in the back of this book, the back cover. It's great. It's great. It's not like, like I said, it's not the best Doc Savage adventure, but these are tremendous fun. Very fast moving, pretty short. This one was only 137 pages in paperback. They're just awesome little adventures, Doc Savage stories, and this one was great. I really enjoyed it. The Phantom City. He can go find a new lost city every book, as far as I'm concerned. He always finds new ways to do things. Doc Savage, always in control. Quite different from the spider novel that I read recently, where the spider barely got through his adventure. Doc Savage, even when things look bad or look grim, you always know he's going to figure things out fairly soon because he's just so good at every single thing. Doc Savage. A lot of fun. The Phantom City by Doc Savage. So I read that, and it was excellent. That was book 305, which brings me to book 306, which is the last book that I finished. And that was The Fantastic Four I am reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four, which ran from 1961 until 1996, when it was inexplicably canceled for the whole Heroes Reborn nonsense. In the mid-90s, Marvel was a mess, and they didn't know what to do with some of their main books, which were not selling all that great. And so they just canceled a lot of them and gave their characters to a bunch of creators who worked over at Image Comics, because Image Comics were doing so well, and just said, hey, take our characters and do something with them. We're too incompetent to do it ourselves. And that was Heroes Reborn, which sucked, actually, overall. But mercifully, I think it only lasted a year. And Fantastic Four was canceled and brought right back for Heroes Reborn with a new #1 issue. But we're nearing the end here of the first run of the Fantastic Four. This particular book has stories from 1992 to 1993. So only a few more years of the Fantastic Four. This is a book that has writing by Tom DeFalco, and Paul Ryan does the artwork. And Paul Ryan is pretty excellent. He's underrated, but he was an excellent artist. He went from Marvel, and he went and worked on the Phantom comic strip for a long time, and then he passed away, and we lost him. But his time on the Fantastic Four, his run on the Fantastic Four was excellent, and it was at this time in the 90s that I started reading the Fantastic Four again, and this is the time where the Invisible Woman breaks out her super MILF outfit. And I had forgotten that the reason she does this is because her mind is combined with the mind of an evil version of herself. I forgot about that part, but so she's badly dressed and kind of a bitch. That was the Invisible Woman at this particular period. And also at this particular period is when the Thing has half his face ripped off by Wolverine. And so he goes around with this helmet on until his face will heal up, which doesn't happen for like years. A bunch of interesting things happen in this series of stories. Johnny Storm burns down a college because he loses control of his powers. So that was cool. And he becomes a fugitive, is hunted down, and all kinds of cool stuff happens. And it was a fun run. And I finished this volume, which is volume 22 in the Epic Collections. Now I have moved on to volume 23, which has stories from 1993 through 1994. There is the Thing with his helmet, and we still have Super MILF over there. Although eventually she changes her costume once again. I'm not sure which one I like better, but yeah, she changes her costume once again. And we still have Ryan on artwork. He stays on this book pretty much to the end, I think. And it was some good stuff. It was a good run on the Fantastic Four overall. There was some goofy stuff that happened, but in literally every run of the Fantastic Four, goofy stuff happens. So what do you do? I'm into the last years of this original run of the Fantastic Four, and I will miss it. But I will be moving on to Spider-Man afterwards. So I'll tell you more about this book next week. I did get a couple things in the mail. I did get an Epic Collection and a DC Finest volume, and those things are, since I collect them and have for a while, those are excluded from the 500 book challenge. These are the only books I can get. So this Epic Collection came. This is Moon Knight. This is Moon Knight Volume 6, which has Moon Knight stories from 1991 to 1992. So more 90s stuff, Moon Knight. This is a character I like a lot. I like the Moon Knight a lot, although I have not spoken about him yet on Epic Comic Book Wednesday. You're going to have to wait a little bit longer for that. So I got Moon Knight, and I also got this from DC Finest, which is basically their versions of the Epic collections. I got Events, and this is Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1. I suspect this is going to be 3 parts, because what this is, it's not just the miniseries Crisis, which was the most important miniseries probably ever to appear in comic books. This changed everything in the DC universe. And this has not just the miniseries, but it has all of the DC comic books at the time. This is Batman here. It has all of the DC comics at the time that, were part of that event. So all the crossover stories, including Infinity Incorporated, which for some reason they have not reprinted yet in DC Finest, but hopefully they will. I haven't read those, I think, since the 80s. So yeah, all kinds of stuff in here. I think, if I'm remembering right, Crisis was, I think, a 12-part, I think it was a 12-part story, just in the miniseries. So I think we'll probably get around, I think that says 4 issues in the miniseries itself, including all of these crossovers. I think we'll get 3 of these. I think. We'll see. We'll see. So that was what I got in the mail. So what am I reading right now, Roger, at this very moment? Well, I just started a book that I'm reading on the Kindle. I have this book physically somewhere, but I don't know where it is. But that book is this one. It is Stormfront by Jim Butcher. It is the first book in the Dresden Files, which I've been hearing about forever. And when I first got on BookTube, I heard a lot about this series, which I had not really heard of before. And I said, you know what, I'm going to read these stories. And I got a bunch of them on my Kindle. So I have all of them that were published up to around 2020, 21, right around there. So that means I probably don't have the last few of them. But I have quite a few on Kindle. And I intended to read them and I never did. I kept putting them off because they sound kind of, it's basically an occult detective kind of thing where you have a wizard. Harry Dresden is a wizard. And it's an urban fantasy kind of thing. And it just sounded a little bit Buffy. It sounded to me like there was a certain amount of Buffiness in this. And Buffy was not my favorite thing. So I was like, maybe I'll put that off, actually. But then recently I heard Grammaticus talk about this. Grammaticus made a video about the Dresden Files. And I thought, you know what? If Grammaticus likes it, it's probably good. I should probably finally read these books. So I got out my Kindle and I started reading this. And I just started reading it. And you know what? It's pretty good. It's pretty good so far. It is one of those things where it does have a certain amount of Buffiness to it. Where it's, there are elves and stuff, fairies, that kind of thing in the modern world. And vampires, I guess. And I'm just started this book, so I'm just learning about this world and Dresden and all the mythology that Butcher builds up around this character. But I have to say, so far, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good book. Hopefully it'll continue to be a good book. And if the whole series is this good, I probably will end up reading it. But I will have to tell you more about this book next week, because like I said, I just started it. I'll finish it this week. I'll tell you all about it next week on my reading report. So yeah, I'm reading that. And I'll tell you all about that next week. And that's, I think, everything I have to say, Roger. I don't think I have anything else to say. Okay, I'll shut up then. I will catch you next time.